After all that fun trying to keep the convoy alive as we brought our tradable goods around to each of the areas, it was very quickly decided that each of the village will supply their own convoy of goods to go around to trade. Of course, there was also a need to find out what was beyond the 3 villages we had so far. To our shock, we found 4 more, all of which were surprisingly isolated still in this massive valley we were in. Each of the mountains raised very high, must have been at least 8,000 feet, if not better. However, I don't remember it being that way when we first came in. However, we did need to find the easiest and quickest routes around. That was not difficult once we started making maps, of course. That being said, the maps were not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is that each of the settlements began to resemble something out of a fantasy novel. Each of them had different types of creatures running around, whether it be demon-looking, ogre-looking, some sort of blue tiefling-looking thing like me, couple centaurs, couple lamias. We always had to watch out for trolls and werewolves, things of that nature. But basically, if it could talk and carry on a conversation, it was pretty much welcome in our settlements. We didn't have too many people migrating from settlement to settlement, with the exception of course, different clans starting to form. These were mostly set up between the different species. I don't know exactly what type I am anymore. I mean, I called myself tiefling, but we don't call ourselves that. We really don't know because we don't fall in any of those fantasy categories. I remember seeing it once on some sort of video, but that was way back in the day. Regardless of all that, once we actually started drawing the maps and figuring out trade routes and starting to send out hunting parties to hunt for our food, gather in groups, of course, and as soon as we possibly could, we began to farm. Again, our villages began to look more like fantasy than anything else, although we didn't have much except medieval knowledge to work off of, so we worked on that. Most houses were now huts. The interior was some sort of castle or keep, and yet there were still walls around one. Different walls, as it were. I made sure to remind people, as I had watched a bunch of videos long back in the day about how castles were built, that we couldn't line all the doors up straight forward. This was to make sure nobody decided to bust down one door and then just keep running into the second. Of course, not everyone thought this way. Others kept their villages rather small and their defenses light, although they had a rather large population. We did not have the largest population by far, however, we were not the smallest group. However, with our large facility in the center, we were actually the most fortified. And it was well known that if anything happens, everyone would come to us, and if all else fails, we would hide in the tunnels. We could get the generators working fairly quick, open the doors, and then just shut the generators down. However, the catacombs, as they came to be called, were not something anyone wanted to go into. We all remember the spiders, of course. As it was above ground level, things started to actually form up in decent societies. We had different shops, farmers, ranchers. One area actually had a river very close by, so they actually had a grain mill, which worked out wonderfully because we had land that we could grow wheat on. Thankfully, we had a few seeds that actually worked out well. We were able to start our own farming, ranching, and so on. Survival's not fancy or glamorous, but it is required. And eventually all the walls segmented out, and they also had cuts in them, different small walls to separate each of the crops as we had to rotate them over time. This was not an easy thing to do as none of us were farmers. We had a couple botanists, but no actual monoculture farmers to work with. So it was not a simple process, and we ran out of our main supply within the first 2 years. Within 4 years, though, everything began to stabilize. However, there was still tension between each of the different settlements, most of which vying for whatever type of wealth they could get, which was normal, as I see we're not beyond human to be too damn greedy for our own good. However, we only had to truly worry about one settlement, the largest of them. It had the largest population. However, many people are hesitant to move out of their area as they don't know if there's going to be residents when they're going to go to another settlement. And staying out in the woods is not exactly something we want to do. The woods are still packed with creatures and monsters that can't speak and are strictly on animalistic senses. Every once in a while, we actually hear the alarms go off because of some sort of skinwalker or some yokai-looking thing that's out in the woods. In fact, it was very, very interesting when we saw what looked like a young woman hiding behind a tree. A few of the guys went out, and by the time I got there, they were within about 20 feet trying to coax her out into the open. And then when she came out from behind the bush, we saw there was more than one. There was 4. There was one adult woman and 3 young kids, all of which that had either cat or fox ears on the top of their head, not human ears. And sure enough, 3 of them had big bushy tails. One of them just didn't have a tail, but had the ears. And the one that didn't have a tail had some sort of strange augmentation on their feet. I was a little nervous as I had seen videos of scary things like this, but at this point, all of us looked scary. So we coaxed her in and added her to her group. Thankfully, she could speak, but she spoke in a language none of us understood. Although we could recognize it was obviously an Eastern language and she was Asian after all, which did make sense. However, this started us thinking. We started looking into the old lore, talking to each other about what was the different type of creatures from their own histories. If you're from Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, each of these began to actually match up. It was very odd. They were outliers, of course, me being one of them, but there was only 3 that we knew of that were like me. There was me, my new friend Roy, and another one who was in the first settlement we were at. And she doesn't leave. She has a job there. A very, well, let's just say it's the world's oldest profession and leave it at that. That being said, everyone matched up again. We couldn't figure it out. We started looking into some of the old names that were on the side of the pods whenever we got the power going. And we could find those that had actually busted out. One we knew was a Minotaur. It only took a quick look at the name to realize that he was from the Greece area. Greece, Italy, that sort of area. It was starting to be an odd add-up of things. However, we didn't really have time for that as the other villages were having a bit of trouble keeping their different clans in line, as some of these were in the double digits of numbers. They easily outnumbered any other different clan, and when I say clan, I mean different species. However, they tended to group together as they were seemingly close. Lizardmen and the Lamias, of course, both being reptiles, would lump themselves together, and anyone that looked almost demonic would be lumped together. And they would seem to draw to each other as well. However, this would form different clans that would argue about who had how many resources, who deserved how many. The typical human bullshit, which kind of made me smile knowing that we were still human enough to bullshit. However, the only problem was we realized that some of them were not upping their defenses, but instead seemingly preparing for battle. I didn't understand this. Why? Why would they prepare for battle? There's so few of us left. We can't get anywhere outside this freaking valley. What are they doing? There's plenty of resources for everybody. Why would they prepare for war? And then it suddenly occurred to all of us. I just wish I was smart enough to understand it. The ones in charge of that village wanted to rule all the villages, forgetting one simple thing, that when you have small groups like this, they must remain separated and cannot fall under a central government as they wanted. The central government would do everything for its own village and leave the rest to rot, stealing all their crops, all their livestock just to bring it back to the central. That's what Rome did, and that's one of the things that destroyed them. The sheer idiocy of indefinite expansion, especially when you know you're limited on how far you can go, is just an insane idea. I led our own group to their leaders to find out what the problem was, why they wanted to do this. I looked up at the two in charge. Both of them had changed into a humanoid version of, I remember hearing Copolava. I couldn't remember. I don't speak the language. But they had bodies that were similar to human, at least humanoid, but had very canine-ish features, but the head was long and stretched like that of an anteater. It was a little disturbing to look at, both of which truly had their wits about them as they began to yell at how they understood things better than anyone else. They should be the ones to rule, and since they are much stronger than them, we all agreed that their village and their village alone was the strongest amongst all of us, but there was no way they could stand against all the villages at the same time, and they should know this. However, they stood firm and demanded that they were the ones that should rule, as they had the strongest army. They would be the ones. If we did not bend our knee and submit to them, then they would come take us by force. Many of us laughed at this. Seriously laughed. They did not laugh, and instead ordered their own people to lower their spears at us. I looked around. Even Billy, with his buddy, since he wasn't hanging around with me, he had another demon friend. I could see both of them spike their tails up in a moment of, oh shit. I looked around, reaching for my blade. None of us had any guns. They weren't any good anymore since we didn't have any ammo. But pulling my blade out, and everyone else did the same thing, I heard one of the other members of the group scream up at these two, "Don't waste their lives, and you don't want to go to war with everybody. You kill us, you have to fight every village at once." It was enough to make both of them think. Both of these anteater-looking things looked at each other, spoke in their native tongue to each other, and then seemed to rub their noses against each other as some form of a kiss, and then ordered the rest to lower their weapons. I stood there with my knife backed away as I would try to reach for my second blade, which I then remembered I didn't bring, and suddenly wanted to smack myself for not doing so. We offered them the chance to forget this little incident and go back to the original status quo. However, they insisted that eventually everyone would bow to them, if not now, but soon. I kind of chuckled at this, as I knew that even with all the other clans and all the other villages combined, they could not breach our inner walls. It wasn't possible. However, they could do normal siege tactics and starve us out. As harvest season was coming up, that was a very high probability. Many of us, as we walked out of their village, were slowly talking with our compatriots. We all made a plan to make sure that our harvest was not stolen. We also made it a point to stop trade with this village, as they had threatened us, and demanded that we give them discounts, let them trade at whatever price they chose, that we wouldn't have a say. There would be no barter anymore. They would dictate what it would be. We would not bend the knee to them. They would be a village alone now, and none of us would allow them close. This would work very, very quickly. Within 2 months, as the first month was harvest season, but the second month, as no more convoys arrived, no more traders showed up at their village, they began to wonder, what were their leaders doing? As their own traders showed up at our gates, we shunned them away and told them until their leaders apologize and to bend a knee in asking for our forgiveness, they would not be accepted in our village to buy, sell, or trade anything. This was non-negotiable. Their leaders would have to come to us and beg for our forgiveness, and then and only then would we allow trade again. This turned their great village into a poverty-stricken area, and many of their own people deserted, deciding to be refugees. However, others decided to take matters in their own hands, claws, talons, or scales for that matter. It was another 5 weeks after their traders had showed up that another group had showed up with one single cart with 3 of their own. They came up to the gate and asked for the leadership of the village. Of course, I went out with the rest of the council. When they pulled back the blanket, as we told them we would not trade with them, they simply exposed what was underneath the sheet and said, well, how about now? The heads of their leaders were there in the cart, with the eyes still rolled back in their head as they had clearly died slowly. There were many bruises and lacerations on the heads before the heads had been removed. One of my colleagues asked them, now who's in charge? They looked at us and said, we are the new council. Just as you have a council, we have a council as well. I looked at them, and the rest of our council members gave a grin and a nod. We shook their hands, and peace had come back to us. We did not have to worry about any sort of battle between any of us. We already had enough problems because the fucking trolls were back. This we would find out only a day later. Apparently the smell of severed heads had drawn them back in, and one of the villages down from us, down to the southwest, had been assaulted by the trolls. They sent up their signal, a simple fire that was only to be lit if they were in trouble. The reason only to be lit then is because the entire tower would catch on fire. It could be seen by every single village. However, the tower itself would crumble after it was burned, and they would have to rebuild it again. We sent our warriors. I led from the front, as we had now fashioned metal weapons and shields, a few chest protectors, and a couple of helmets that we could possibly get, and we made best speed over. We saw the trolls still ripping into their main building. It was made of stone, and we made sure they had the right type of mortar, but they did not have a manufactured building like we had. We came at the trolls making as much noise as possible to try and get their attention away from the ones we could hear screaming inside. The trolls were having a hard time reaching in and grabbing their dinner, as the village had backed up and pointed spears out, so every time the trolls reached down, they got spiked in the hand. It wasn't much more than basically a strong pinprick, but I'll tell you, it slowed them down just enough. The trolls turned towards us. Thankfully, there was only 2 of them. They started walking towards us, and I was able to raise my sword just in time to see something go flying past over my head. I turned around and realized that one of the other villages had built a ballista, a fucking Roman scorpion, but a lot bigger. How the hell they got it there so fast, I didn't realize until I saw who had carried it. Their biggest, their brawniest, and their strongest had run through and were right now breathing heavy on the ground as they were trying not to vomit from their overexertion. Others had drawn it back and fired. Thankfully, it had struck one of the trolls. It was more of a glancing blow than anything, but it had caught it in the ribs. The first troll that was not hit stopped and looked at his compatriot that screamed in agony, and then looked at us in actual fear as it realized that we could do major damage. The second troll reached down, grabbed the ballista head, and pulled it out, but apparently it had been barbed and caused a lot more problems on the way out than it did on the way in. We saw blood begin to spray far out, probably 15 to 20 feet before the ballista bolt was landed on the ground. We could hear in the background, as we raised our shields for the incoming attack, the clink, 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 clink of the ballista being reloaded as fast as possible. This was obviously well rehearsed by them, and we were grateful for it. As the troll that wasn't hit decided to make its run, we charged at it, trying to keep it as far away from the ballista as possible, as we knew it was our best weapon. I remember going up and swinging my sword, catching it in the leg. Unfortunately, as soon as I swung, it bounced off. Apparently, troll hides are really tough. However, they're more susceptible to piercing weapons, and any type of pike that was hit on it pierced into the skin. Many of them were smart, and when the pike entered, they twisted for maximum painful effect. It wasn't going to cause the troll to bleed out, but it sure was going to make it hurt like hell. The troll ended up dropping to its knees and started to swing at us. I saw many of my brethren get swatted to the side and thrown at good 30 or 40 feet, either into the bushes or into the trees. Unfortunately, you would hear the occasional sickening crunch as the body struck a rock or a tree, and you knew that bones had just shattered inside. Looking at the troll that was leaning over, swatting at everybody, the one that had caught the ballista bolt to the side was still holding its side with one hand as it went up. It grabbed its buddy and it retreated. You could see that it was trying just to get away. And I was actually amazed, too amazed to say anything, as thankfully one of the others actually started yelling, pull back, hold fire, hold fire. I looked back and one of the others was waving both hands at the ballistas. They had brought a second one in, and apparently the one that had been hit before realized that they were outmatched now, and they ran back. We screamed, yes, we won, we won, we won. Oh crap, what about our wounded? We ran over to all of them, and unfortunately, it was bad. It was really bad. The actual strike from the hand, being that was made from flesh, did not cause a lot of damage, as those that had been hit by it and just flung off to the side and rolled over were in a lot of pain, but nothing was broken. Possible concussions, but nothing severe. No internal damage. The ones, however, that had come to a very violent stop were not so well off. Many were bleeding out as their ribs had broken and gone into their lungs. They coughed up fluid, and unfortunately I may have knowledge in quick field medicine, basically trauma medicine, but there's only much I can do with the limited amount of supplies we had. We only had one medical bag out of all of us. Nobody had thought to bring another, which would not be a mistake that happened again. However, the ones I could save, I did what I could. We had a few people who knew how to sew, which was wonderful. But having to set bones in the field is not something you want to remember. The sickening crunch is almost as bad as when you hear them land on the tree or the rock or whatever had messed them up. I had lost another one of my friends today. Georgie. He was just a little thing. He was barely bigger than a goblin himself, but he was young. He was a teenager, basically. He wasn't one of ours, but he was a friend, one I knew from one of the other villages. He made the run over and ran in with a spear. I found his spear. It was covered in troll blood, but unfortunately, we brought back our wounded and our dead. We're still human that we don't leave our people behind no matter what. And those left behind need to be able to grieve as well. We looked around and realized that we had just all spilled blood together. The one village that had been attacked was broken down for what resources it could and then broke apart to the other villages. The different clans splitting across the different villages, now down to 6. They swore they would come back and rebuild, but from what I could see, there wasn't much to rebuild at all. The stone foundation held, which was the only reason they were still in one piece. However, every single other building was gone. The wall was smashed. The wall was covered in spikes that were covered in blood, but then I thought to myself, wait a moment. I asked the ones next to me, do you remember seeing another one, because the spikes were covered in blood? And those trolls didn't have wounds on them that I could see. That is when one of the others that were at that village told us that, yes, there was 4 originally, but some had decided to run through the wall and got injured, so they ran off. I started to wonder if these trolls were just giant goblins as they would run away. But since we had all fought alongside each other, there was absolutely no question anymore if there was going to be peace in the valley. We looked at each other, and it was actually an understood treaty, though we didn't have anything to sign. Our new refugees into my village settled in very easily. Although a little shook up, they were fine. They just had to get over the trauma of what had happened before. It was decided that since the trolls had to come from somewhere, we would reach out and find out where the hell they were coming from. So small groups of no bigger than 5 were decided on, myself included. We're going to go out and find out where these bastards were coming from. They had to come from somewhere. If we could either hunt them down or block them out, maybe it would happen. But we had just got peace to the valley, and we couldn't afford to lose another village. Each one was extremely important to maintaining the rest. So it was decided we would go out and search. And the search itself brought in some amazing results. As it turns out, the valley was not as restricted as we thought. There were ways through. There were ways out of this valley. We just didn't see them. We didn't know them. It wasn't caves that we originally found. It turned out to be tunnels. Long man-made tunnels. We had just not known about this because none of us had worked here. I had found one of our own with, of course, my group. And we looked across and we could see that there was a couple of those military vehicles on the outside that were just knocked over. We looked close and realized that one of them had been torn asunder. This larger truck had actually been pushed over by something. We could see that the driver's side door, which was facing up, had a massive dent in it. We tried to open it up and absolutely nothing. It was jammed. However, the back of it was covered by a tan canvas, which looked like it had been clawed to pieces. It didn't take long for us to find a whole bunch of blood inside. But this time, what we found around there was a lot of spent shell casings. The brass was everywhere. It looked like they were trying to fight something. However, looking around, we couldn't find any parts, though after this long, we didn't expect to find any. Though inside the back of the vehicle, again, we did find bloodstains everywhere. It was also with that Humvee that was over there. However, this one was the type that was hard around the top. It was armored up on top. And it was more, well, crunched. It's like something went and stepped on it. When we looked inside, we were actually disgusted. We did find bones. What was left of somebody had been crushed inside behind the driver. It was actually enough to make one of our party vomit all over the place. However, we did end up looking down the tunnel. Though we didn't have any firearms anymore, we were able to scavenge a few extra rounds out of what was there. Reaching inside the man's old gear and pulling out the magazines, which were still fully loaded, was a troubling experience, to say the least. Though when we got back, we still had the weapons. Now we actually had something to launch out of said weapons. Until then, we had a tunnel to explore. Looking down, we had to make some torches, as most of our flashlights had run out of power a long time ago. We started walking in, and it didn't take long for us to realize that the tunnel was really, really long. We couldn't exactly see the other side of it. You would think you would see some sort of daylight. We got to what we figured was the center of the mountain, and we came up across a actual blast door, another one. But this was not the same type. This was the type of blast door that came in from the side instead of swinging open like a door. We looked over to see if there was any type of control panel, and sure there was, and the damn thing lit up. How could this thing still have power? We started hitting a couple of the buttons to try and get it to open, and the mechanism began to work. However, as soon as the mechanism started to open, we looked over and it started to close again. There was a huge ka-chunk as it tried to hold itself. It only opened for a few feet and then started closing again. I could hear one of my compatriots yell over, "What the fuck?" We asked what was wrong. He said, "Override." This thing says override on it. What do you mean override? Who's overriding what? What's going on here? We tried it again, and sure enough, the door would begin to open, and then it would close, saying override again and again. We tried this at least a half a dozen times, and yet it would always override. The thing is, we would wait a certain amount of time in between and then just randomly hit the buttons. What made this interesting is it wouldn't stop at a certain point and then hit the override. It was always something different. It was almost as though there was someone controlling it, yet they didn't have the ability to shut off the console that was next to us. We started looking around to find if there was any type of manual we could use. It didn't take us long to find the panel, and sure enough, there was a manual cutoff switch. It not only cut the power, but if we looked in behind it, there was a crank. It hooked up very, very similar to that of the type of jack you would use to punch up a car. So we started getting going, and sure enough, the door began to open. We were filled with excitement as we didn't realize that maybe we could get everybody through this and maybe lock the door behind us. We wouldn't have to worry about the damn trolls anymore. We wouldn't have to worry about the dragons. We wouldn't have to worry about all sorts of God knows what that's rolling around these woods that we have to either kill off to eat or just kill just so we don't die. So we started getting 2-3 of us on the crank at the same time, and all of a sudden we heard something drop behind us. We turned and looked, and I know from a moment what it was. I remember from the video games. I reached up and tried to cover my ears as fast as I could, and then the massive boom happened. The flash as well made it difficult to see, but I had closed my eyes in time so it didn't happen as bad. And then the door began to shut again. We looked over, sure enough, it said override again. Something was going on. We couldn't figure out what was going on at all. We started asking what we should do. However, most of us couldn't hear for a couple of minutes. Then we heard something we really didn't want to hear. We heard the sound of crawling and scritching again. We know exactly what that means, and we don't want to be in an enclosed area when those things show up. So we immediately packed everything up, marked it on the map, grabbed whatever we could, and got the hell out of there. We made it out in time, and we looked back, and we could see several of those creatures coming out of the vents, and they began to swirl around the end of the tunnel. However, they did not seem to want to come into the sun. A few of them poked out into the sun and stayed there for a few seconds. They didn't seem to really be in pain, but they really did not like the sunlight for some reason. Then we heard something else we really didn't want to hear. The footsteps of trolls. The trolls were coming. I know they eat these things. And we all looked at each other, and we didn't have to say anything. We knew we had to go as fast as we could, running through the woods, and we'd eventually get back to our village before nightfall if we ran the whole way. Getting inside, we fell over, fully exhausted, and had to wait a few minutes before we could tell everybody what was going on. All of it stood to reason, of course, all the different things we had seen and come across, with the exception of the fact that one of our members said, "Dude, how the hell did you get hit by a flashbang?" We all looked at him, and I realized that's what that was. The thing that exploded inside the tunnel. The thing that made our ears ring even now. Yeah. How did that happen? We went to the other villages and we got as many people together as possible. And we were going to find out what in the hell is truly going on.